My name is Connor Hayes, and I, with the mentorship of Dr. John Bowen in the Department of Geography, am presenting on my project about the spatial trends of multi-home ownership in college towns and non-college towns. The initial idea for this project was to look at temporal trends as well, but we decided that it would be better to look at modern data and try and see if there's a spatial trend to what we call multi-home ownership, which is essentially the conglomeration of housing under fewer and fewer owners, typically to be used as rental properties. And some of the literature I read was focused on that, but not precisely on the trends, just that it's a thing that happened. And I was trying to see what that spatial trend was in Washington specifically. So I wanted to look at single-family zoning just because it's sort of the American ideal, the American dream there. And the cities I used were Ellensburg for Central Washington University, Cheney for Eastern Washington University, Sunnyside, Wenatchee, and Everett as my three non-college control towns, essentially. Most of the processing occurred in ArcGIS Pro. That's where my spatial analysis happened, and that's where I set up what I call a core, which is a 5-kilometer buffer that encompasses the single-family parcels around that and excludes the others, which fall into another category. And this core is either set up around a university campus or a subset of the downtown of these cities. And this I first had to separate out single-family homes to do, otherwise I would get all the commercial and all the apartments, and that's not what I wanted to look at. After that was done, I exported that to Excel, and I used something like the code below, after organizing things alphabetically by name, to try and determine if there were if the names matched throughout the cells, and that would put out, that last line there basically one of the last lines there basically put out a number telling me, hey, this one is a landlord house. And I had to adjust this for each town because of the way that the data was laid out, but I think it was pretty accurate for everything. For Ellensburg, this is the map it gave me. The maps themselves, due to the scale, it's hard to, especially for Ellensburg and Cheney and such, to see the actual trend. So I've got figures later on, but these are what I spend a lot of time on, just making these maps and trying to provide something visual. And if you look closely, you can actually see the individual red dots there and how they cluster more typically in a core setting. Cheney itself is a little bit smaller, so there are fewer houses outside of that core, and it's also more compact than Ellensburg. But it's still got a very similar trend, and the outer actually has very few, if any, multi-home ownership properties. Sunnyside is an interesting site because it fit entirely within my 5-kilometer buffer. So I've only got, you could call it a core, you could call it an outer, I'm just gonna go with core for it. You've only got core data for this. So it's not exactly the best control in this situation. Everett, most of the properties and the core itself are focused in the north, though we do have splotches of single-family homes that are in the south and the west of Everett there. And we can see later on that there is also a trend with more multi-home ownership being centered in the core and around the core than there is in the outer. Wenatchee proved to be a bit of a problem, actually. It is somewhat of an outlier in and of itself, and there are lots of large parcels that appear to fall under the multi-home ownership category, which also skews data further on. So I've begun calling this an outlier, and I ran the analysis for this several times just to make sure I wasn't doing anything wrong, and it still ended up coming out. Without delving too deep into all of the data, I wanted these here to sort of show that Wenatchee is a massive outlier. It is consistently backwards from everything else. Disregarding Wenatchee, overridingly, there is a higher concentration of multi-home ownership in cores than there are in outers. And For Ellensburg in particular, its core is higher than the non-college towns that we analyzed. Cheney's a bit weird in that only really its parcel ownership can be considered higher than the other two towns that we analyzed that were not college towns. But that could be because it's such a small town, and it could be just due to the nature of the analysis here. And issues I came across while doing this project included zoning codes, which seem to vary from city to city and county to county. Bellingham's zoning code is very, very different from everything else. Its data was also extremely hard to get. And the last issue we came across was that Sunnyside fit within my 5-kilometer border. There are things that, now that I've gone through this, I could definitely change. I could do something like a graduated border to try and keep that core analysis that I was doing and get that going with Sunnyside. But overall, I still think that this data shows that there is a trend for more multi-home ownership, at least percentage-wise in value, in acreage, and in raw parcel number in college towns, especially around the college, than there are outside. Here are the references I used just for background information. And I would like to thank you for listening.